Based on the information we have now, we have every reason to believe this was an act of terror. In addition, want to note that because this is an ongoing investigation, all New Yorkers should remain vigilant. At any given point, New Yorkers may find a piece of information, hear a conversation, see something that could very much aid the NYPD, the FBI, and our partners. Want all New Yorkers to be vigilant.
That, of course, the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio. Originally, he did not call the bombing terrorism, but today he did just that. And joining us now with more, Frank Spano. He's logged a long day with us. He's the executive director of the Counterterrorism Institute, and also with us, Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, and Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. All right, a lot to unpack here, but I'll first start by saying I always find when people say be vigilant, what does that mean? And then the second thing, see something, say something. I think a lot of us think of it, oh, it's a trait. But I got to tell you, it worked. You you go to what happened, starting on the first incident on Saturday morning in the Jersey Shore. Somebody saw something, didn't belong there. They called the authorities, delayed the actual race here, and as a consequence, yes, the guy was a moron and put it into a steel thing, but leave that aside here. It prevented possible loss of life. You then fast forward what we saw in Elizabeth, even before then in Chelsea on the 23rd Street. IED that hadn't detonated. Somebody saw something, called the authorities, and once again, that was taken out. The same thing also that was done the following day, as we saw in Elizabeth here. The mayor of Elizabeth said it could have been hundreds of lives here. Now, we joked about it. I mean, it's funny now in respect, instead of the gang who couldn't shoot straight, possibly the most inept terrorist or wannabe in the history of bad guys. But nonetheless, people saw something, went to the authorities, and as a result, Frank, this thing got turned around. So I'll acknowledge it. Those, often used phrase here, there's really something to it.
Absolutely. Sometimes we talk about sometimes we win, sometimes we learn. This weekend we did a bit of both. We definitely won from the idea that we are actually engaged in our own defense. This cannot be someone else's problem. And unfortunately, we live in a world where the information is just bombarding us. We're always in social media, always in our phones. Time to get our heads up and be aware with this 360 all around us. And
also the Joint Task Force worked here, where we saw in past different agencies not cooperating, whether it be the feds, who I think took lead here, but then you have the NYPD, you have the Jersey law enforcement. They actually worked and shared tactical information, let alone intel on the ground.
Exactly, which was a huge jump from pre-9/11, where we didn't see that at all. And that was one of the greatest takeaways. The learning moment from 9/11 was that organizations in law enforcement and intelligence need to work together, need to share that. I think we've seen a very unified command structure, we've seen a very unified response from all aspects of law enforcement.
You were with me live in the set when the FBI did their briefing at One Police Plaza. And while the assistant director was going to be short on details, understandably so, he seemed pretty definitive or pretty clear that they think they got the guy. That he's not part of a wider cell. How can they be so sure after 50 hours? The guy did go to a pretty decent geographical footprint to put 4 different devices. And I know evidently you can figure this stuff out online, but how do we know that maybe, if at least as you said, he may have been inspired by a third party, he could have also gotten some tactical advice here? How are we sure that he's really just a lone wolf at this point?
Absolutely, and that sort of splits 2 sides. From the operational control, this individual was likely not under full operational control of a foreign terror organization. But given the sophistication of the devices, even though they were somewhat rudimentary, they were still well ahead of what the average Joe in their basement could cook up. And so in this case, there was very likely inspiration, if not active training and education, albeit, thankfully, not sufficient education to cause a complete detonation.
And there is a gap in his timeline where we believe, I'm talking about the person in custody right now, where he spent as many as somewhere between 2 and 4 years abroad. He was a U.S. citizen, but he went back to Afghanistan at some point. He may have also gone to Pakistan. There could be some other date lines here that they'll fill in the gaps. We don't know what happened, but from at least anecdotal accounts from neighbors, et cetera, he seemed to come back changed. We don't know if he's been radicalized. We don't know, if there is anything that can be attributable to that window of time to the person he was in the last 50 hours. in terms of all the chaos that he wrought, but nonetheless, they're looking into that. It just seemed to me a little bit that, okay, they're confident there's no more devices. They're confident they got the right guy, but they're pretty sure at least that's it. And he hasn't cooperated with them, so it's not like they've gotten any verbal intel from him.
Right, and in the coming days and weeks, law enforcement will begin to go through digital evidence, forensic evidence, not only from the devices obtained, but also in search warrants that have been executed at his home. There was another executed in Perth Amboy.
Yep.
I don't know that we still don't know what the response there was, but collecting digital information, looking at communications trails, whether that be social media, traditional email, et cetera.
And explain how this dingbat, when he put the flip phone on the device that didn't explode in Elizabeth, as we understand, it was his personal phone.
Correct.
And that, as much as also, and you can explain better than I, the powder substance that he had used to work as a form of a to help detonate it.
Right.
Explain how those two elements have really helped law enforcement.
So they were definitely able to identify this individual through that cell phone, and the fact that the same devices were used across the same circuitry was utilized across the devices, whether it was a pipe bomb or pressure cooker, that has definitely been able to tie all of the incidents together. Elizabeth, New Jersey has not yet been definitively tied, but we're very likely to see that come in the future. This is one of the things that we see a lot in arson, when arsonists believe that they can leave information or clues and don't worry, it'll just burn up. In this case, very likely believe that that phone would detonate. Either that or he was entirely inept.
And that's one of the reasons why we think that this wasn't connected to the Central Park bombing that happened over the course of the summer, because the devices are so different and the circuitry is so different?
Correct.
And the MOs too.
And the MO. And though the FBI was very careful and the NYPD was very careful not to release any information about that device, even the actual propellant, the powder utilized, is different between the two, or at least that's what we understand at this time.
You know, guys, next segment we'll be talking to a guest who's with the FBI for 30 years, including one of the point guys in New Jersey, and we'll talk about the issue of profiling, which is what Donald Trump spoke about today, and bring that up as a debate subject. But there are a couple other things that struck me. One is, we saw what happened with New York last night. Understandable. I have no problems with anything they did. But let's say we won't look back as we will on this one, and this was just, you know, a guy couldn't get his act together with horrible intentions, etc. 29 people injured, thankfully none very seriously, all have been released from the hospital. You can only shut the bridges down for so long. You can only check so many people's bags getting onto trains or subways, or check cars coming over the spans. I guess part of me said, you know, can you stop all this? If a guy can go online and figure out how to do what he did and not have to go and get exotic, you know, it's not like he got chemical weapons here or anything. Give an idea, not that I'm trying to give a tutorial on how to do this, but he had a crock pot, he had, you know, basically, and he took some, you were talking about some of the products that they found undetonated that you can get either at a Walmart or at a supply store, right? I mean, this is not that hard to do, and look at the chaos that he wrought over a two-state area. It's
absolutely correct. I mean, tannerite, black powder, totally available over the counter. It is even available by mail. It's totally unregulated, and it's used for everything from agriculture all the way to recreation and sporting. What we did see this time, 50 hours from detonation to apprehension, we've begun to rely more heavily on the technology that's available, and that will continue to have to grow as we move forward, because the personnel, we just can't keep up with the threat.
And we were talking about this. What struck me was, if you looked at the timeline from when the first thing happened, from that road race, that 5K run, to what happened in Chelsea and then what happened in Elizabeth, there's either social media footprints on all this, or there is, you know, security cameras that are catching it. If you didn't know already, my gosh, you know, this isn't just downtown Manhattan. This was, you know, Seaside Park and Elizabeth, New Jersey, and there's cameras everywhere now.
And to your point, Richard, even video of when those heroic police officers opened fire against him.
In audio, on social media.
There's audio and video. And so to your original point, and I agree with your original point in terms of, you know, it may sound kind of goofy or corny if you see something, say something, but for law enforcement and for our own protection, it may be the best protection or tool that we have going forward, because we only have X amount of law enforcement officials, and they can't cover everything, as you said, noting the bridges, and we can go on and on and on.
It's impossible to put a whole community on lockdown.
With that in, I'm curious, Frank, how much of the policing on bridges and subways and being able to shut stuff down is really designed to prevent attacks, and how much is designed to be a deterrent so that people who might think about otherwise doing harm think to themselves, well, there might be a cop there that might search the car, maybe I shouldn't do this.
Right. We would hope that an individual would be deterred by all manner of security measures. Unfortunately, what we do see is that a committed enemy that has well planned the attack will continue forward with the attack until stopped. That said, there is a great degree of planning that typically goes into terrorist attacks, and hopefully it's a consideration that the more they see that their plan is likely to be foiled, or that they are likely to be caught before they can execute the plan, the less likely they're going to be to move forward on that.
Finally, we spoke, I know we have to take a break soon, about advances in technology of things like retinal scans and facial imprints where but again, all that seems to be designed, and it was amazing, in 50 hours what they were able to do here, okay, with what started off as a road race, where there were no eyewitnesses to the person doing this, on a seaside community in Jersey, right? To where we are right now. But nonetheless, while there's technological advancements, it would seem to be a forensic tool, kind of a technological one, to accelerate solving it or find the person. But in a preventative thing, should we have databases so if people are trying to buy gunpowder, the authorities know? Should we have somebody that if they go abroad to any of the countries that are hotspots, whether they're American citizens, and he was, that there's a notation here for a second to say, wait a second, this guy should be on the radar of something if he gets radicalized or whatever else. Where does the line start and stop between Big Brother and then also keeping track of things that might be helpful for later?
Well, there's been a lot of debate about that on both sides of the aisle with regard to the fact that this individual was not on the terror watch list at any point.
And he really didn't have a rap sheet. There was one assault issue, and again, the person who brought the claim, a family member, dropped it at a certain point.
Exactly. So the question becomes, if someone travels to a country that we know to be hostile, or at least to harbor hostile ideologies against the United States, and that person travels back to us, should they then be on a watch list instead of having to go before a screener who basically asks, were you over there involved in terrorism? To which they just say no, and they move on with their daily life.
Although this guy, I'm surprised what he would have answered. Anyway, when we come back, we're going to bring our next guest, a 30-year veteran of the FBI out of New Jersey, to talk about the investigation into the bombings and what he sees and has seen in his time in New Jersey as it relates to some questions about whether or not there is some populations there that are more likely than maybe in other places here to act in a radicalized manner.
We have the best police force, NYPD, Nassau County, Suffolk County, FBI, state police. They meet on a regular basis. It's a dangerous world. We have to accept that. But on the other hand, we should also realize that we have the best police and law enforcement in the world right here.
That Congressman Peter King touting the local police departments, and there's no exaggeration that this was probably as good a good example of cooperation between the different agencies as we've seen. And he's talking about in New York City, well, they're working with the feds on the bombing investigations, investigation that covers 2 states here, as well as I mentioned, multiple agencies. Now joining us now is Aaron Ford. Aaron spent 30 years with the FBI, special agent in charge at the Newark Division. Now he's he's a VP, I should say, at PSENG. Listen, you've seen it from many vantage points. You saw some of the concerns pre and even in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 of stovepiping when agencies didn't play ball together. Not only did they work with each other, but they seemingly helped each other this time. It actually, this joint task force seems to work. It certainly did for the last 50 hours, didn't it?
I would agree with that. One of the things that happened as a result of 9/11 is we in the law enforcement community during that time realized that there was a gap in cooperation and working together with one another. and it spanned from the federal authorities, state, locals, all the way down into the communities. So since that time, there's been quite a heavy effort into making sure that there's communication, collaboration, and cooperation amongst the agencies, and that law enforcement has gotten out into the communities. Because usually in these type of cases, there's someone out in the community that could provide some really valuable evidence that law enforcement can go on.
You know, no two cases are the same here, but I can't remember something where, and we saw the briefing with the FBI earlier today and the law enforcement, that it seems that this guy, either as a lone wolf or maybe he was incentivized by somebody else, but it doesn't seem like he was working in concert with a cell, went from Seaside Park to Chelsea, then back to Elizabeth, and seemingly, as I said, in a lone wolf. Did that surprise you, as the investigation seems to unfold here, that this wasn't part of a much larger conspiracy with other parties?
Well, I'm not so sure that he's not a part of anything outside of himself, that he's in fact a lone wolf. Time will tell. The investigation will bear that out. There is a possibility that there might have been someone out there aiding him, helping him, someone that he got materials from. We don't know that as of yet, but it does appear right now that there's one person that the law enforcement authorities are focusing on. And that is really not unusual if it turns out to be the case, because sometimes you have one person that feels disenfranchised by government, by society, and he or she may be in grandma's basement looking at the internet at all times of day and figuring out ways that he or she may strike against America.
You know, Aaron, there's been this perception, and certainly I think it's one that Donald Trump fostered, what he said, that people were cheering in the streets of New Jersey and certain Arabic communities after the towers fell on 9/11, that there are hot spots in New Jersey, whether it's in Jersey City, Patterson, a few other places that are rife with these kind of potential populations. You are 30 years in New Jersey. Can you separate rhetoric from reality here when it comes to that?
Yeah, I'll tell you the reality. The reality is the American people band together at times like this, and they work with one another, and we're all as one, and they support law enforcement. During my time with the FBI, I never saw or witnessed a group or a bunch of people that were anti-government, law enforcement in the way that I've heard described before. But then again, I am aware that there are some people out there that want to do harm to America, but by and large, America bonds together.
When you saw some of the findings of this investigation where the phone apparently was intact, that didn't explode in that IED that they had set aside in Elizabeth, give an idea to the public who doesn't know this, in your experience, just what kind of a treasure trove of intel they could get from these unexploded devices that seem to have some of the same hallmarks, whether it be the one in Chelsea on 23rd Street that didn't explode or the one that we saw in Elizabeth.
There are a couple of things from that. There's this saying that I'd rather be lucky than good any day, and that was an extreme stroke of luck that the government would find that device intact, because that can provide fingerprints as to other jobs that may be similar, and maybe even identify additional people, certainly the person that's in custody right now. In addition to that, the person that was arrested for this crime is alive. And that is another treasure trove of potential information. The FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force will send their best interviewers and interrogators to talk with this individual. And if he is predisposed to provide information, they will get it out of him.
Donald Trump said something today which says, hey, this case, what we saw for the last 50 hours, proof positive. You need to have racial profiling here. You need to treat different populations differently. It's a reality of 2016. What would you say to that?
No, I would disagree about racial profiling. The thing about profiling, there's a right way to profile and there's a wrong way. The right way is criminal profiling. The wrong way is racial profiling. And let me be clear, there's no place for racial profiling in law enforcement, no place for it in our Constitution, no place for it in America. However, when you look at criminal profiling, that is profiling based on an individual's actions. And that is certainly fine to take a look at what a person is doing, as opposed to the color of their skin or a religious garment that they're wearing on their head. That is wrong. It always will be wrong and should continue to be wrong. But criminal profiling, we should use every legal means that's necessary to protect America.
Aaron Ford. Aaron, thank you for the time. I appreciate it. All right, guys, a couple things from that conversation. We'll get into the politics of this because certainly it's very real. And we'll do that next segment as it relates to both the reactions of both Trump and Hillary. But one of the many things that Trump did say today is proof positive, this Exhibit A, we need to bring back racial profiling. Now, my guest just made the distinction between criminal profiling and racial profiling. Is that semantics, Frank, or are they two very different things?
Well, to some degree, there is a degree of semantics there. We heard earlier Hillary's response, we're after the individuals, not after the religion. In this case, we are after an ideology, and that ideology happens to be rooted in, or at least advanced by, a specific religious belief. It would be the same thing as if we went back and we're hunting the Italian mafia in New York City, but we're only checking out Irish neighborhoods, or we're only going to Protestant churches, or we're only working in those communities instead of going to Catholic churches and dealing with Italian neighborhoods, which was largely the American mafia. So there is a difference, but it's somewhat a political issue. It's somewhat a bit of semantics there.
But if you're going after a race, or if you're going after a faith, or whatever else, I've heard from a lot of folks, it's very easy to not only forget about civil liberties and where it starts and where it stops, but it's counterproductive too, because at the same time that you're going to be trying to, figure out what mosque this guy's in, you want the imams coming to you and saying, I got this crazy guy here saying some really weird stuff here, and he's not the kid I knew 2 years ago. Exactly. You want them coming to the authorities. So if you create an us against them, right, it doesn't work for you, right?
That's correct. And it has to be something. We've heard this time and time again, that the community itself, so in this case, the Islamic community, has to stand up against the radical elements within it. Because until they do, and until they begin to take that stand, they will continue to be pooled together with every crazy, every terrorist, until they get it together.
Plus, how many tens or hundreds of thousands of American Muslims travel to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Iraq every single year and come back? So it's such an enormous number. First of all, it seems like it would be impractical. And second of all, you would flood the resources of the people who have to parse through that data to try to find the needles in the haystack that they're actually looking for.
But also, there's an unspoken part to this, which is, if it's not a two-way street and it's a one-way to say, hey, listen, you people, you don't come and tell us when there's trouble here, we're going to blame all of you. They're less incentivized if they hear you people than if it goes the other way. Now, I've heard that from police brass who are not doing the PC routine when the red light's not on the camera. They'll tell me, if you keep doing this, they're our best source. Where do you think we get our breaks from? They come and they tell us what's going on. But if we keep saying, yeah, we're going to infiltrate your mosques, you don't know who's going to be on the prayer rug here. It could be one of my guys undercover. They're going to be far less likely to help you out, right?
That's true. I mean, we have to get to the point where we call an ugly baby an ugly baby. If it is radical Islamic terrorism, then it is radical Islamic terrorism, because it frames not only the response, but it also frames the tools and the techniques that are utilized.
But here's my problem. I've heard Trump say, oh, we're afraid to say it. Okay, I think at one point Obama even did. He goes, I'll call it that. Now what? What did that exactly get me? I said the 3 magic words, okay? What does that magically do? It doesn't say, okay, all of a sudden I can press the magic red button and we're going to solve the problem because I said the 3 words. I hear the semantics and the political season of it, but what I just don't get is how practically, to Andrew's point, if you basically say a whole region of the world are dangerous, and you're not even making distinction between who are American citizens, like this guy was, right? Versus somebody who are coming here and overstaying their visas and you want to keep an eye on them because you got tipped off about them. It just seems to be, my gosh, an impracticality for guys in your world to be able to watch millions of people just because we said so.
That's true. And active surveillance on an individual is, to your point, Andrew, is resource intensive. Having someone on a list where they travel back and forth and their movements are checked, fine, that's not that difficult.
Well, and I think you're touching on something that I was getting towards also, which is that it seems that you would need another variable. The pools are just too big.
Correct.
Traveling to these countries, or even Muslim or not Muslim, let's say you want to use those two, you would still need something else, some indication that they've been radicalized, or that they're on some sort of list, a terror watch list.
And if I could, apparently where he went to was one of the most Al-Qaeda intensive strongholds, or that was the most unstable, that was completely controlled by radical elements. They knew that was part of his travel.
Which is fine, but you would either need to ban everybody from going there or allow everybody to go there. I mean,
or that could become that additional variable that you mentioned.
Well, what are the kinds of variables that we might look for to try to enhance and hone down on who exactly we should be watching for?
Without getting too far into tracking communications, which I think really does begin to break into the civil liberties issues, locating actual physical locations within the country is going to take additional resources in country. Because when someone checks in or out of a country, they get the stamp that says Afghanistan, but it doesn't say Afghanistan, P.S. he went to the Al-Qaeda stronghold. So we do have to find a better way to address that issue.
When we come back here, more about the politics of terror. As we've told you, we're 50 some odd days out here, and each candidate is in that final stretch. And of course, this became a huge issue come November, the reaction to the bombings, and we got both reactions from the candidates. Will this be a big factor in the race? We'll discuss after this.